Hey, welcome back. It's good to have you here again, settling in at the edge of the day. Before you drift too far towards sleep, take a second, right now, while you're still awake enough to remember, to tap, follow, and like. It helps this quiet corner of storytelling keep glowing in the vast dark of the digital sea. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. I always like knowing the weave of places where these stories land. The cities, towns, and tucked away pockets where people close their eyes with us. For now, though, let the last tension in your shoulders unknot itself. Let the breath drop low and steady. The night outside can be whatever it is, cool, warm, windy, still. But here, in this moment, you've got a place to rest. A place where the world won't tug at you for a while. Tonight, we're stepping toward the edge of an old coastline. A coastline that's held its shape longer than the memory of anyone alive. And on that stretch of worn stone and wind-smooth cliffs stands a lighthouse, unlike any other. A lighthouse that kept two different times, faithfully, insistently, as though waiting for someone patient enough to notice. So, settle in. Here we go. Chapter 1. The Lantern on the Headland. If you stand far enough back from the headland, far enough that the grass shifts like a single creature breathing under the wind, you can see the lighthouse rise above everything else with a stubborn, time-worn dignity. It has that look older structures sometimes have, the sense that someone once built it with more hands than they needed, more stone than was practical, more care than was required. People used to build like that. And standing before this lighthouse, you get the quiet reminder of it. From the village road, especially at dusk, the tower's lantern turns slowly, as any lighthouse would. Except here, in this place, there was once a second turning, subtle, nearly invisible, unless you knew what to look for. The villagers called it the shadow rotation, a faint suggestion that the beam didn't always match the clock, that sometimes it repeated a movement or skipped one entirely. Most chalked it up to old machinery, nothing more. But the records, the logs kept by the keepers, told a different story, one that stretched over more than a century. The first time I heard about it, I was sitting in a tiny harborside cafe, the kind where the windows fog over no matter the season. An old man at the next table, white beard, cap pulled low, leaned over after hearing I was interested in coastal history. He tapped the wooden table twice, as though calling an old memory from its hiding place. "You're asking the wrong questions if you want the truth," he said. "Ask about the hours. Ask why the lighthouse kept two of them." He spoke the way people do when they've told the story before and aren't sure they want to again. But he kept going. He said that every keeper who worked the lighthouse eventually wrote the same thing. The light doesn't follow the hours we keep. Each keeper phrased it differently, but the message was the same. The tower was tracking something, some rhythm older than clocks and steadier than the tides, a rhythm only the lantern seemed to understand. As the cafe's door groaned open and the wind spilled across the old wooden floor, he added one more thing. The second time, the one the lighthouse keeps, it only shows itself in fog. That stuck with me. Fog has a way of softening everything, of drawing edges inward until the world feels both closer and more distant. And so, with his quiet words lodged deep, I made my way to the headland the next morning, long before the sun had fully decided what kind of day it wanted to be. The lighthouse stood waiting, solid, patient, as if it expected me. And that's where our story begins, with a structure that refuses to follow just one time, and the long trail of keepers who tried, in their own quiet ways, to understand why. Chapter 2. Keeper Elias and the First Logbook. Elias Rowan was not the first keeper of the Headland Lighthouse, but he was the first whose words carried the weight of a person trying, earnestly, to understand it. Earlier keepers had simply recorded weather, tides, occasional passing ships, and the rhythmic maintenance of machinery. Elias asked questions. His curiosity hums between the lines of his logbook like a faint undertone, the sort you don't notice until you read a passage twice and realize something in it is quietly unsettled. He arrived in the spring of 1893, stepping off a cart with 2 trunks, a sealed envelope from the Maritime Authority, and the kind of posture that suggested he'd been carrying the worries of other people for most of his life. He was in his mid-30s, thin but hardy, with eyes that seemed to take stock of everything at once: sky, soil, the angle of wind, the condition of ropes tied near the shore. People in the village still spoke of him as a man who worked deliberately, as though every action carried a small ceremony. The lighthouse in his time was rougher than it appears today. The stones were darker, raw with salt, and the iron fittings showed the streaks of decades spent in storm air. When Elias first walked into the lower chamber, he wrote, "The tower feels older inside than it does from the road, as if the stone remembers more than it is willing to show. The air along the interior walls is cool, though the day is mild. I felt a faint shift in my watch as the door closed behind me. Not the usual change of weight, something else. A misalignment." That last word appears often in the first third of his logbook. It took him a full day to make the place his own. He cleaned the dusted corners, organized the shelves of spare wicks and tools, and repaired the rope that lifted oil barrels from the supply cart. And that night, his first, he climbed the spiral staircase with a lantern, the flame flickering in a narrow glass chimney, casting long, oblong shadows up the ascending walls. The final room, the lantern chamber, was warm, not from heat, the lantern was unlit, but from something subtler. He described it as a latent warmth, like a memory trapped in the metal. He lingered, examining the great lens, the complex array of prisms fitted like a geometric sea creature, each edge shining faintly even without fire. He wrote, "I wound the mechanism and let the lantern turn. It moved smoothly, too smoothly for its age, but after 3 orbits the shadow cast along the western wall seemed wrong, delayed by a hair's breadth, only noticeable if one truly watches. A delay. A fraction of a second that his mind snagged on like a loose thread. He tried it again, and again. Always, there was something off. Sometimes the rotation was ahead of his pocket watch by half a second, sometimes behind. Never drastically. Never in a way that would disrupt the lighthouse's role, but enough that Elias, whose job was built on precision, began to suspect the mechanism was not following standard time at all, but tracking something close to it, running alongside it like a shadow moving beside a body. It wasn't until his second month that he recorded the first fog incident. At 3:17 in the morning, a heavy fog rolled in off the sea. The lantern's beam thickened, cutting short of its usual distance. The room shifted in a way I struggle to describe. It was as though the turning of the lantern slowed without actually slowing. The watch ticked its steady beat, but the space around me seemed to drift aside. A moment later, I checked the secondary log by the base door. The clock there reported 3:11. 2 clocks, 2 times. He spent weeks studying the discrepancy. He checked the wiring, the gears, the weights. He built a makeshift pendulum that he hung in the lower chamber, timing its swings with meticulous care. He measured the wind outside, the humidity, the salt content in the air. He observed the long, slow pulse of ocean tides, and yet the problem persisted. Worse, it grew more precise. The difference between the lantern's time and recorded time wasn't random at all. It followed its own rhythm, one that repeated every 13 days. A gentle drift, one way and then the other, like a breath inhaling and exhaling. Elias didn't call it the second time. That phrase came much later. But he noted that the lighthouse kept a parallel hour, invisible but present, folding itself around the true one. The villagers thought little of these notes when he later shared them, casually over mugs of strong tea. They assumed the isolation was getting to him. A man alone with wind and stone can start hearing details others ignore. But Elias was meticulous. He was not the sort to hallucinate. Patterns. One line, written halfway down a page, almost apologetically, shows how deeply the puzzle lodged itself into him. Either I am measuring the wrong thing, or the tower is measuring something I cannot yet name. It wouldn't be long before he would find out which it was, and with that quiet determination, he stepped into a mystery that would outlive him by generations. Chapter 3. The Watches That Disagreed. You can tell a lot about a lighthouse keeper by their relationship with time. Some keepers treat the hours like obedient tools, numbers to be tallied, shifts to be endured, intervals to be managed between storms. Others see time as a companion of sorts, steady and reliable, a quiet rhythm that carries them through long nights. But Elias, he treated time like a language he hadn't yet fully learned, one he kept listening to in hopes of catching the subtleties between the ticks. By the height of summer, his interest in the lighthouse's strange rhythm had grown into a disciplined investigation. Not frantic, Elias was never frantic, but focused, intent. He began keeping 2 watches on his desk, laid out side by side on a folded cloth. The first was his personal pocket watch, brass casing worn from years of use, a gift from his father. The second was a newer one, issued by the Maritime Authority, built for precise coastal work. Every morning, before boiling water for tea, he wound both of them carefully, aligning their hands down to the second. For the first few days, they ticked in harmony, 2 steady heartbeats in the small keeper's quarters. But, inevitably, as fog rolled in, or the lantern chamber warmed with the sun, the watches shifted. A hesitation, a subtle drift. Not much, never more than a few seconds out of step, but it was enough for Elias to write, in his meticulous handwriting. The watches disagree again, not broken, simply unconvinced by each other. At first he tried to blame the environment. Salt air could do terrible things to metal. Humidity had a talent for finding weaknesses in gears. He cleaned them, polished them, protected them under a glass dome he fashioned from a spare lantern cover. But the drift continued. Then came the afternoon when he carried both watches up to the lantern chamber. He placed them on the rim of the central mechanism, a safe distance from moving parts, and listened. At first, everything seemed normal, 2 clocks ticking in steady unison. But when the lantern completed its slow, gliding rotation, a soft tremor moved through the chamber floor. The sort of vibration you might miss unless you spent most of your time inside stone walls. Elias, kneeling beside the watches, eyes level with the tiny hands, saw the change instantly. His father's watch paused for less than half a heartbeat. The newer watch overshot by nearly the same fraction. When the tremor passed and the floor stilled, both resumed ticking, but now nearly 2 seconds apart. He recorded it immediately. Then he tried it again the next day, and the next, and the next. Every time the lantern reached its western arc, right where the beam would skim past the cliff toward the open sea, the tremor returned, barely there, like a whispered reminder of something hidden beneath the foundation. That was when Elias began to suspect the most unnerving possibility of all, that the source of the drift wasn't above him in the gears or around him in the humidity, but below. The lighthouse, like many built on rugged coastlines, had a foundation that reached deep into the stone, but this tower was different. Old maps showed something beneath it, older than the lighthouse itself. A circular structure on the headland sketched faintly in charcoal, its purpose left carefully unmarked. The lighthouse had been built on top of it, as though the older structure had been too stubborn to remove, or too important to disturb. Elias mulled that over for days. If the tower sat on something ancient, could the tremor he felt be more than the settling of old stone? Could it be that whatever had once stood there was influencing the lighthouse still? He didn't leap to conclusions. That wasn't his way. Instead, he brought the watches down to the ground floor, placing them near the old trapdoor in the corner, the one every keeper before him had nailed shut, painted over, and quietly ignored. The trapdoor that led, according to a rumor he once heard in the village, to the original structure's foundation. When he set the watches beside it, he felt it immediately, a faint pressure in the air, like the buildup before a summer storm. Dust rose from the boards in the slightest breath of movement. One watch ticked forward, the other stalled, just once. A tiny hesitation. He wrote, "Time is thinner here," and then, after a pause, "Something is listening." He kept that thought to himself, not out of fear, but out of respect, as though naming it too boldly might startle whatever subtle order lay beneath the lighthouse. It was during this period that villagers began to notice a change in him. He still visited the harbor, still exchanged polite words, still purchased flour and candles and letters. But he walked with the air of a man living in 2 worlds at once, the world of people and the world of hours that didn't quite align. One fisherman later recalled, "He'd look past you sometimes, like he was listening to a clock no one else could hear." Maybe he was, because on the 13th fog-laden morning since the drift first appeared, Elias opened his logbook with a sentence more revealing than he ever intended. The lighthouse does not follow time. It chooses it. And though he didn't yet understand the meaning, he could feel the truth of it settling around him, like fog finding every low place on the cliff. Chapter 4. Fog that remembers. Fog on the headland was not unusual. It came often, rolling in slow and deliberate, the way a well-trained animal moves across familiar territory. But there were certain mornings, and Elias was the first to pay attention to them, when the fog arrived as though it had intention. Not maliciousness, nothing sharp or threatening. Just a quality of awareness, as though each drifting tendril carried some old memory of the land and was searching for where to place it. It was one such morning, early September, the sea calm, the sun stalled somewhere behind a thick gray veil, when Elias began to grasp that the lighthouse behaved differently when the world outside was blurred. The entry he wrote that day was longer than most, filling 2 pages in his measured, slightly slanted handwriting. Fog settled before dawn, lantern dimmed to a half reach, could barely make out the rocks below. At 4:16 the chamber became markedly colder. Watches disagreed by 7 seconds. Walking the stairs I felt the sense, not of being followed, but of walking through a place that recalled footprints from long ago. People often describe fog as erasing details, smoothing edges, dulling sound. But Elias insisted the opposite. He wrote that fog revealed things, not visually, of course, but in the subtlety of sensation. Footsteps echoed differently. The wind sounded older, carrying hints of something patient beneath it. And the lighthouse? The lighthouse leaned into the fog like a creature breathing in an element it understood more deeply than clear air. That morning, he ventured outside with a lantern shielded in his coat, walking the perimeter path that circled the tower. The grass was beaded with moisture, every blade bowed under tiny droplets. The world felt smaller, quieter. Even the crash of distant waves softened into something more contemplative. Halfway around the tower, he stopped. There, just at the edge of perception, was a pulse. A tiny shift in the ground, not enough to unsteady him, but enough to make him pause. The same tremor he had felt in the lantern chamber now echoed faintly through the earth itself. He knelt, pressed his palm to the damp grass. Nothing. Then, a breath later, something. A rhythmic vibration, subtle as a heartbeat buried under layers of stone. A slow inhale, a slower exhale. Not mechanical, not random. A pattern. One he instantly recognized because he'd been charting it for weeks. It matched the drift between the 2 times. When he returned inside, his hair and coat wet with fog, he brought the watches to the base of the spiral stairs, and there, for the first time, he witnessed a full cycle. The lighthouse's time nudged ahead, then settled back. A second's difference becoming 3, then 2, then aligning for a brief, uncanny moment. His own watch ticking steady, faithful, unaware of the quiet negotiation happening around it. He paced the lower chamber for nearly an hour, listening, feeling. He wasn't imagining it. The air carried a mild pressure, as though some ancient atmosphere pressed upward through the floorboards. That was when he noticed the trap door again. It hadn't changed, of course. Still sealed, still paint-chipped, still framed by old nails that rusted themselves permanently in place. But in the fog, the boards around it seemed darker, as though the moisture had seeped through in a way different from the rest of the room. He leaned down, brushing a fingertip across the wood. It was warm, not hot, not heated by anything mechanical, just warm, like the memory of a handprint left moments ago. He wrote, "In fog, the lower chamber feels occupied." He didn't elaborate. Elias rarely dramatized. If anything, he downplayed sensations that unsettled him. So, for him to use that word meant something had changed, not outwardly, but in his understanding of the place. The lighthouse wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't drifting randomly. It was responding to conditions. And fog was the catalyst that made the second time surface more boldly. Later that same morning, after the sun failed entirely to push through the gray, another anomaly occurred. The beam. The lantern was lit, turning slow and steady, but the beam behaved strangely. Instead of its usual crisp rotation, Elias noticed a faint echo trailing it. A softer glint, like a second shine slightly delayed, almost chasing the first. He moved around the chamber, checking the prisms. No cracks, no unusual reflections. The machinery was unchanged, but the echo remained. A second rotation, a shadow beam, faint as breath on glass. He timed it, 37 seconds behind the true beam. He checked his watches. Both had begun drifting again, one following the main rotation, the other falling instinctively into rhythm with the delayed beam. Not perfectly, but close enough that his pulse quickened in that quiet, inward way where excitement and unease mix. In the fog, the lighthouse wasn't keeping two times. It was showing them. Vanished as soon as the fog thinned. Gone, like a secret hiding again. But Elias had seen enough to know the truth. The second time wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't a measurement error. It was a presence, something woven into the lighthouse's foundations, older than its stones, older even than the keeper's records. Fog merely allowed it to breathe, and though Elias didn't yet grasp the meaning of what he'd found, he felt, deep in the slow, steady chambers of his own intuition, that the lighthouse wasn't simply tracking time, it was remembering something, or someone, and the fog was helping it recall. Chapter 5. The Engineer Who Measured Silence. Silence can be deceptive. Some people think silence is simply the absence of noise, but anyone who has spent long hours in solitary work, in a workshop, a field, a study, or a lighthouse, knows better. Silence has texture, it has weight, it can press in, close or hang back and give you room. It can unsettle or soothe. And sometimes, if you listen long enough, silence suggests the shape of something hiding just beyond the edges of sound. That truth mattered deeply to the man who would become the lighthouse's most unusual visitor. His name was Alden Kittredge, a soft-spoken engineer with a quiet mind, and the kind of patience that seems bred into people who spend their lives listening to machines. He arrived in late autumn, carrying a satchel of instruments and a small steam-powered timing device he'd built himself. A compact contraption of gears, springs, and finely etched metal, capable of measuring vibrations too subtle for ordinary clocks. He didn't come on official business. No one in the Maritime Authority had sent him. Instead, he came because he'd heard stories, little fragments that drifted into his workshop from sailors, dock workers, and the occasional coastal inspector. Stories of a lighthouse where the timing of the lantern wasn't entirely faithful to the rest of the world. Stories of a keeper who took notes with an almost scientific rigor. Stories of a fog that altered the air around the tower. Alden didn't believe in myths. What he believed in were patterns. And something about these stories suggested there was a pattern here worth uncovering. When he stepped off the cart near the headland, the wind tugged at his coat, carrying the faint scent of impending rain. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, glanced toward the lighthouse rising above the cliff line, and nodded as though greeting a familiar adversary. Elias greeted him politely, cautious at first, as one might be when a stranger shows unusual interest in one's solitary post, but warmed quickly. Engineers tend to recognize each other, even across different trades. The careful way Alden handled his instruments, the way he observed a room before stepping further in, the subtle adjustments he made to his footing on the stairs. Elias trusted him more than he expected to. Alden spent his first hour not asking questions, but listening. He listened to the mechanism in the lantern chamber. He listened to the wind through the top windows. He listened to the faint metallic hum of the gears as the lantern rotated. Then he placed a hand flat on the central column of the lighthouse, the tall stone core running from the foundation to the lantern room. His eyes narrowed. "There," he said. "Do you feel that?" Elias hadn't expected anyone else to notice. Most visitors never did. "It's very slight," Alden murmured. "Not a mechanical fault, something deeper, rhythmic but not periodic. A cycle nested inside another cycle." That was the moment Elias realized that for the first time since arriving on the headland, he wasn't alone in perceiving the anomaly. Alden unpacked his instruments with the careful, almost ceremonial movements of a man who respected his craft. There was the steam timer, of course, a polished palm-sized device that ticked in a rapid, efficient rhythm. But there were others as well, a set of small tuning forks, a narrow brass tube he called a harmonic register, and a little cube of knurled metal that vibrated at a predictable frequency when wound. Elias watched with growing curiosity. "What do you expect to measure?" he asked. Alden smiled faintly, a quiet, unshowy expression. "Not sound," he said. "Silence. He placed the harmonic register on the floor of the lantern room. The little tube quivered, the faintest hum rising from within its hollow body. It was so soft, Elias almost mistook it for the whistling draft around the window panes. Alden adjusted a dial on the side. The register reacts to changes in atmospheric pressure, he explained, but in certain cases, it also responds to, well, I don't yet have a proper term, subaudible resonance, vibrations below the threshold of normal hearing. Elias nodded slowly. So, you believe the tower resonates? I believe, Alden replied, that the lighthouse is being affected by something beneath it. And whatever that something is, it communicates not through noise, but through interruptions and silence. He wasn't wrong. As the lantern rotated, the harmonic register pulsed, barely perceptible, but there. A tiny flutter in the hum, a brief softening, as if silence itself blinked. Elias leaned closer. Alden listened again. The lantern turned. Then, a shift. Not in sound, but in the absence of it. The harmonic register's hum thinned. The air cooled. Both men felt the faint tremor ripple up through the stone. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Alden fiddled with the steam timer, checking the tiny engraved dial. His expression tightened in quiet satisfaction. 11.5 seconds difference between the vibration and the lantern's expected alignment. He scribbled the number in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. Elias, meanwhile, checked his watches again. One had drifted forward, one lagged behind. Alden noticed. 2 times, he said softly. You weren't exaggerating. Elias gestured toward the floor, toward the unseen foundation. I think the source is down there. Alden knelt, placing his hand on the stone. He closed his eyes, listened more deeply than seemed possible for an ordinary man. You're right, he murmured, and it's not mechanical. It's not geological. It's intentional. Elias stiffened. Intentional? Alden opened his eyes, not alarmed, merely focused. There's a cadence, he said simply. A purpose, silence that isn't empty at all. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. I'd like to measure it during fog, he said, if you'll have me stay. Elias nodded. He didn't say so aloud, but he felt a faint relief, something steadying in having another mind. Here, someone who could articulate things he himself only sensed. And so Alden settled into the lighthouse for what was intended to be a 2-day visit. He stayed nearly 3 weeks. During that time, he recorded shifts in the silent resonance beneath the tower. He charted the drift of the 2 times with precision Elias admired. He listened not just to the lighthouse, but into it, as though it held a story he was almost ready to tell. And as the autumn fogs thickened, Alden's harmonic register began picking up something new. Not a rhythm, not a vibration, something closer to an echo, as if the silence beneath the lighthouse was remembering a sound that hadn't existed for centuries. And as the fog deepened, so did the mystery. Chapter 6. Letters left in the walls. By the time Alden had been on the headland for nearly 3 weeks, the lighthouse had begun to feel fuller than it ever had before. Not crowded, not noisy, just inhabited in a way that suggested its long silence had finally found 2 listeners patient enough to understand it. Elias noticed it first in the small things. The way the lantern's turning seemed smoother when both men were in the chamber. The way the foundation's faint tremor shifted subtly when Alden placed the harmonic register on a particular floor stone. The way the air felt dense with unsaid meaning, as though the lighthouse recognized that someone was finally trying to read it properly. It was during one of these long, quiet afternoons, the sky outside a muted stretch of pale gray, the waves barely rising against the stones below, that Elias discovered the first letter. He hadn't meant to find it. He had only been moving a narrow cabinet away from the wall to retrieve a fallen pencil. But as he shifted the cabinet aside, a section of the interior paneling loosened unexpectedly, revealing a thin gap behind it. Elias leaned in, frowning. There, tucked between old beams and dry mortar, sat an envelope. Age had yellowed it around the edges, but the seal, a pressed shape resembling a lantern, was surprisingly intact. Elias held it gently, like some small creature that might crumble with too much pressure. The front bore no name, no date, only the words, "To the one who keeps watch." He brought it upstairs where Alden was calibrating the timing device. When Elias set the envelope on the table, Alden froze mid-adjustment, his gaze sharpening behind his spectacles. "Where did you find that?" "In the wall," Elias said, hidden deliberately. Alden set aside his tool carefully. "Open it." Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, fragile but still legible. Elias unfolded it slowly, flattening it between his palms. The handwriting was ornate, older than either of them expected. The letter read, "If you are reading this, then the hours have begun to disagree again. Do not be alarmed. The tower remembers what has been buried beneath it. The drift is not a warning. It is a request. Beneath that, there will come a fog when the second hour stands before you plainly. When that day arrives, listen, not to the light, but to the silence between rotations. Then a final line, its ink darker, suggesting the writer pressed harder to make the words endure. I could not finish what was asked of me. Perhaps you can." There was no signature. Elias exhaled slowly. Alden's expression darkened not with fear, but with the intensity of a man whose suspicions had just been confirmed. "This isn't the first keeper who's noticed," Alden said. "Far from it." They spent the next few hours inspecting the wall more thoroughly. The lighthouse, built in layers over decades, held small inconsistencies in its interior construction, gaps where boards didn't quite meet, seams where stone had been patched, corners where a previous keeper must have made repairs. But most of these imperfections were superficial. It wasn't until Elias tapped on a lower section near the floor that they both heard it, a hollow echo. Alden knelt beside him and ran his fingers along the seam. "A false panel," he murmured, or at least an older part of the wall they covered at some point. Working carefully, using the flat end of a maintenance tool, they eased the panel away. More dust rose, and behind it lay a second envelope. This one was heavier, sealed with red wax, stamped with the emblem of the Maritime Authority. Elias broke the seal. Inside were 4 folded pages and a small metal key. The first page was a letter, dated 1861, written by a keeper named Rowan Hale. "To whoever serves after me, the tremor has returned. The lantern's rotation loses itself when the fog thickens. The hour splits, the watches disagree, and the silence becomes heavy enough to feel in the chest. The townsfolk think little of it, but they do not stand watch as we do. Further down, if you find this, use the key only when the cycle reaches its quietest point, when the second time nearly overtakes the first. You will know the moment by the thinning of breath in the tower. At the bottom, do not open the lower chamber alone." Alden took the key and examined it. It was narrow, forged from iron so old it had gone almost black. The teeth of the key were short, uneven, not standard maritime design. "Which lock do you think it fits?" Elias asked quietly. Alden didn't answer immediately. He turned the key over in his hand, studying its shape, its wear, its faint trace of salt corrosion. Then he looked toward the corner of the room, toward the trap door. "The one no keeper ever talks about," Alden murmured. Elias felt something steady in his chest shift. Not fear, recognition. The trapdoor had always unsettled him slightly, not because it looked ominous. It didn't, but because it didn't belong to the original lighthouse blueprints. It predated them. Even the wood was older, its grain thicker, its smell sharper, when scraped. So the key wasn't for a maritime lock. It was for whatever the lighthouse had been built onto. Alden lifted the harmonic register, holding it near the trap door. The device shivered immediately, not wildly, not dangerously, but with an unmistakable reaction. "The silence is strongest here," he said, "and something beneath wants to be heard." Elias knelt beside the sealed door. Under his palm, the wood felt faintly warm again, the same strange warmth he'd noticed during the fog, a warmth that had no business coming from a cold stone foundation. "Do you think," Elias asked softly, "that the drift between the times is tied to what's below?" Alden nodded. "I'd stake every instrument I own on it." The lighthouse creaked gently as a gust of wind pressed against the western windows. Elias looked down at the envelope once more, rereading the most striking line. "I could not finish what was asked of me." Asked by whom or by what? He didn't have those answers yet, but for the first time, he had proof that the mystery didn't begin with him, that the lighthouse had been asking the same quiet question for decades, maybe longer, and keepers before him had tried to listen. The discovery of those letters didn't solve anything, but it changed everything. Because now the lighthouse wasn't only a machine, it wasn't only a building, it was part of a conversation, one spoken in vibrations, fog, silence, and time. And beneath it, something patient waited for someone who understood how to listen. Elias closed his logbook for the evening with a final note. The tower keeps 2 times, and now it keeps 2 seekers. Chapter 7. The tide that arrived early. The sea around the headland had always been predictable. Even in storm seasons, even in years when the coastline saw unusual winds, the tides themselves kept to their old unbroken rhythm. Rising and falling in the quiet, stubborn way the ocean obeys its deepest laws. Fishermen in the village could tell you the hour of high tide without looking at a clock, simply by glancing at the angle of foam on the rocks or the shine along the harbor stones. But on a cold morning in late autumn, something unusual happened. The tide came early, not alarmingly early, not enough to flood anything or send boats straining against their moorings, but early enough that when Elias stepped outside to check the weather, the sea was already lapping halfway up the lower rocks. He checked the sky first, clearer than expected, a thin band of pale sunlight stretching across the horizon. He checked the wind, calm, from the south. Then he checked his watches. Both read the correct time, at least the correct surface time, yet the sea below whispered a different hour entirely. Alden came out moments later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, the harmonic register dangling at his side. "You sense it too," he said quietly. Elias gestured toward the water. "The tide's ahead of itself." Alden lifted the register and held it toward the ground. The device hummed, steady at first, then wavering, then steady again. "Not a weather event," Alden murmured. "Not the moon, not pressure. The resonance is shifting again." Elias frowned. "Do you think the tide is following the second time?" Alden was silent for a long moment, the wind stirring gently around them. Then he nodded, once. "I think," he said slowly, "that the lighthouse isn't the only thing keeping a parallel hour." They walked down the narrow path carved into the cliffside, boots slipping slightly on damp stone. When they reached the outcrop where waves crashed, both men paused. Something about the foam pattern was unusual, moving with a slow, unhurried pattern that didn't match the visible swell. "It's like the water's remembering a different cycle," Elias murmured. Alden crouched, dipping his fingertips into the sea. He flinched. "It's warmer than it should be." "How much warmer?" "Enough to matter." They stood there, listening to the tide. There was rhythm, yes, but layered, as though 2 sets of waves were moving through one another, slightly out of phase. The longer they listened, the more Elias felt the same subtle misalignment he experienced in the lantern chamber. A kind of doubled cadence, one obvious, one hidden. Then Alden said something that startled Elias more than anything he'd heard yet. "The second tide arrived last night." Elias turned toward him. "How do you know?" Alden lifted the harmonic register. "It woke me," he explained. Sometime after midnight, when fog pressed against the tower with a thick, wet heaviness, the register had begun vibrating in a slow, pulsed rhythm. Not rapid, not frantic, but unmistakable. A long echo of something beneath the lighthouse responding to something in the sea. Elias listened as Alden described it. 3 long pulses, 2 short, a pause, then a faint tremor through the floor. Elias felt a chill move through him, not from cold, but from understanding. Those pulses mirrored something he had recorded weeks earlier, the pattern the second beam followed when fog revealed it. The lighthouse, the tide, the resonance beneath the floor, all sharing the same cadence. Alden straightened, brushing his hands on his coat. "I've been thinking about the letters," he said, "especially the one that said the drift was a request." Elias nodded slowly. He'd been thinking of that word as well. "What if," Alden continued, "the foundation below us isn't simply responding to the environment, but signaling? What if it's been waiting for conditions to align? Fog, tide, the silent cycle beneath the tower, all synchronizing." Elias looked out at the water, the early tide still rising with an almost ceremonial patience. "You're suggesting the lighthouse wasn't built to measure time," he said softly. You're suggesting it was built to meet it. Alden didn't answer, but the silence between them was enough. They stayed by the waterline longer than they intended, watching the waves break in their layered rhythm. There was no sense of danger, no urgency, only the quiet impression of something ancient stirring, something that kept its own schedule, one long overlooked by the surface world. Then Elias noticed something in the foam. For a moment, brief, faint, no more than a trick of light. The foam didn't disperse normally. Instead, it curled into a slow spiral pattern before slipping back into the tide. Not natural, not random, a precise coil, the shape repeating every few waves. Alden saw it too. His voice dropped. "That's not water," he murmured. "That's a pattern." Elias stepped closer to the edge. "It's the same spiral in the old foundation map," he said, the crude charcoal sketch he'd studied weeks earlier, showing a circular structure beneath the lighthouse with a faint spiral carved inside it. Alden's expression tightened. If the tide is aligning with whatever's below us, it means the cycle is reaching an important point. "Important for what?" Elias asked. Alden looked toward the lighthouse rising above the cliffs, its lantern still turning in the clear morning air. "For the request," he said quietly. "For whatever unfinished business the tower has been carrying through its 2 times." They walked back up the path with slow, thoughtful steps. Neither spoke much. There was too much to assemble in their minds. Letters found in walls, keys meant for ancient locks, fog carrying memories, silence that vibrated, tides that moved out of order. By the time they reached the doorway, Elias paused, one hand on the weathered wood. "The next fog," he said. "We should be ready." Alden nodded. "We should open the lower chamber." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of distant brine. Elias closed the door behind them and wrote in his logbook, "The tide obeys 2 clocks, and the lighthouse waits for the moment when both finally meet." Chapter 8. The Keeper Who Never Slept at Night. The lighthouse had known many keepers before Elias, men and women whose names were scattered across old harbor records, half-faded inscriptions, and logbooks that smelled of sea salt and ink left too long in the cold. Most of them kept routine schedules, living by the familiar rhythm of daylight and lamplight, waking when the sun rose and resting when the lantern no longer needed tending. Ordinary people living ordinary hours. But one keeper broke that rhythm entirely. Her name was Maeve Calder, though villagers rarely spoke of her. Those who did always lowered their voices, as if discussing a ghost still lingering around the headland. She'd served nearly 40 years before Elias, though fragments of her writing suggested she felt older than her years long before she arrived. Maeve never slept at night, not once according to her records. During the day she would rest in short bursts, an hour here, 30 minutes there. But as soon as darkness crept across the sea, she became fully awake, alert, almost energized. She called the nighttime hours the honest hours, as though daylight obscured things she considered important. Elias first learned of her from a water-damaged ledger, stored in a wooden chest beneath the lantern's tool bench. Maeve's handwriting was angular, deliberate, and unmistakably tired, not frantic, just resigned, as if she'd been carrying a truth no one else would acknowledge. One sentence in particular stayed with him. "The lighthouse keeps its true time when the sun is gone." Alden read that line twice, then closed the ledger gently, as if afraid to disturb the weight of her words. "There's something here," he whispered, something she understood that no one else did. They spent an entire evening reading through Maeve's notes. Many entries were terse, weather reports, ship sightings, maintenance logs. But interspersed throughout were observations that echoed their own experiences with uncanny precision. "Fog thick tonight. The walls breathe. Watches refuse agreement. The lantern pulse is doubled. Shadow beam visible on the southern arc. Second tide arrived during last rotation, pressure rising beneath the stairwell. And then, they speak in the moments between sound." Elias drew in a slow breath. Alden let out one. The more they read, the clearer it became that Maeve hadn't been merely recording anomalies. She'd been trying to decode them. She had charted the cycles of fog, cataloged the tremors beneath the floor, and timed the difference between the 2 hours with mathematical precision. But it was her observations about nighttime that interested Alden most. "Listen to this," he said, adjusting his glasses as he read aloud. "The The day belongs to the surface world. The night belongs to the deeper hour. When these two overlap, stand clear of the foundation. Elias glanced at the trapdoor instinctively. "What do you think she meant by deeper hour?" he asked. Alden traced a finger along Maeve's faded ink. "She's talking about the second time," he said. "Only she recognized something we hadn't yet. That the second time isn't always present. It's strongest at night, especially in fog." Elias took the ledger, studying Maeve's sketches, crude spirals, overlapping circles, a small diagram of the lantern room. Beside them, she'd written, "When night meets fog, the lighthouse remembers." Maeve had stopped sleeping at night not because she feared something, but because she didn't want to miss it. She seemed to believe that the lighthouse revealed its truest nature only when the world outside was quiet and the fog thick enough to soften sound. There was one passage, a longer one, that chilled Elias, even though nothing in it was overtly frightening. "I waited in the silence tonight. The air thinned around the lantern. The floor trembled once. I felt the second hour rise like a tide beneath my feet. It asked for something, not in words, but in patience." Alden sat back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "She experienced the same cycles we've been observing," he said, "only more intensely, and she tried to respond to them." Elias nodded. "But respond how?" It was several pages later that they found the closest thing to an answer. "I have watched the deeper hour for 30 years. I know its breath now. Soon it will ask again. I feel the pull of the unanswered moment." Maeve had sensed something approaching, a culmination, a meeting point, but she never wrote what that moment was. The last few pages were missing entirely, torn neatly from the binding, not ripped in panic, removed with intention. Alden frowned at the empty seam. "She took them," he said quietly, "tore them out herself." "But why?" Alden tapped the narrow strip of binding where the pages had been. "She didn't want the next keeper to find them until the cycles aligned again. She tore them out because the moment she wrote about hadn't come yet." Elias closed the ledger. The room felt dense with thought. The missing pages weren't a confession. They were instructions. Held back until the right hour, the deeper hour, returned. Elias looked toward the trap door, toward the foundation below. "We're close," he said softly. Alden nodded. "Very close." That night, the fog returned, slowly, deliberately, rolling across the cliff with the same quiet intelligence Elias had sensed before. The lantern beam grew thick, heavy, shortened by the mist. The air cooled, the subtle tremor rose through the floorboards, and for the first time, Elias understood Maeve's strange devotion to the night. Because as darkness deepened and fog wrapped around the lighthouse, the whole tower seemed to shift into a different state of being. Not a building anchored in stone, but a conduit waiting for a message. At 2:13 a.m., Alden's harmonic register began to pulse. At 2:14, Elias's two watches fell out of agreement. At 2:15, the second beam appeared, faint, delayed, but unmistakably present. Elias wrote one sentence in his logbook before returning to the lantern room. "The deeper hour is rising," and the lighthouse felt as though it were waiting. Chapter 9. The Second Lantern. The night the deeper hour rose, the fog was so thick the lighthouse felt suspended in it, not surrounded, not obscured, but held, as if the mist were a pair of careful hands cupping the tower with deliberate gentleness. Elias felt it the moment he stepped into the lantern chamber. The air was different. Not colder, not warmer, but denser, like breath caught between inhale and exhale. Alden was already there, standing with his back to the great lens, the harmonic register in one hand, his other resting on the metal railing. The lantern rotated slowly behind him, its light carving a muted arc through the vapor that seeped in around the window seals. But the real change wasn't in the fog, or in the wind, or in the trembling that rose through the floorboards. It was in the light itself. The main lantern shone in its steady cycle, bright, sure, dependable, but just behind it, delayed by only a second or two, the faintest echo of illumination trailed along the chamber wall. Not a reflection, not a flaw, a second beam, the second lantern. Elias saw it first from the corner of his eye, a dim shimmer that followed the true beam like an obedient shadow. He turned his head slowly, watching it sweep across the stone. It was softer, almost silver instead of gold, and it moved with a steady grace that didn't match the mechanical rotation of the primary gear. "Alden," Elias whispered, "it's stronger tonight." Alden didn't turn. He had seen it too. "I know." The harmonic register buzzed faintly in his hand, irregularly, like a small creature responding to something unseen. He held it closer to the floor. The hum grew sharper, then steadied into a long, low vibration. "The second hour is aligning," he murmured. "We're near the point Maeve wrote about, the overlap." "The moment she prepared for," Elias said. "The moment she never reached." The second beam brightened slightly. Only slightly, barely enough to illuminate dust motes in its path. But the fact that it strengthened at all meant something was changing in the tower's core. Elias approached the lens. Could a lantern have been built here before the lighthouse? He wondered aloud. Something beneath the tower? Alden shook his head. This echo isn't mechanical. It doesn't follow the gear. It drifts ahead sometimes, then lags. It's following something deeper. Elias watched as the true beam passed overhead, followed by the slow glide of the second beam, trailing it like a ghost without urgency. "What if," he said quietly, "the second lantern was never meant to guide ships?" Alden looked up. "What do you mean?" Elias touched the cold glass of the lens, not the bright, warm interior light, but the outer edge where condensation gathered in tiny beads. "I think it was meant to guide something else," he said, "or someone." Outside, the fog thickened so much the world beyond the window vanished entirely. Not even the outline of the cliffs remained, just pale, drifting gray. Alden walked to the eastern window and pressed his palm against the pane. "The second beam reacts more strongly to fog," he said. "Fog amplifies it, almost as if the moisture carries whatever resonance the deeper hour is part of." Elias stepped beside him. "So the fog is the conduit." "And the lighthouse," Alden added, "is the instrument." They watched the shy silver echo sweep across the chamber again. For a moment, it paused, ever so slightly, right by the western wall, hanging like a held breath before continuing its slow rotation. Alden frowned. "That delay shouldn't be possible." Elias nodded. "It chose to linger." The harmonic register buzzed sharply in Alden's hand. He glanced down at it, then lifted it toward the ceiling. The device shivered harder. "Something's above us," Alden whispered. "Something responding to the second beam." Elias looked up, expecting nothing but rafters and old metal fittings. But the shadow cast on the ceiling by the second lantern was wrong, softer around the edges, as if cast by a light whose source wasn't entirely in the room. "We need to see this from below," Alden said suddenly. He hurried down the spiral stairwell, Elias close behind. Their footsteps echoed, soft and hollow, in the stone shaft. The tremor beneath the tower grew stronger, not violent, just insistent, like a soft heartbeat under the floor. On the lower landing, the second beam shimmered faintly through the narrow slit window, impossible, given its weakness above. Yet there it was, a muted silver arc. Alden stopped. Elias nearly bumped into him. "Look," Alden whispered. The second beam wasn't merely passing across the lower wall. It was aligning with the trapdoor, perfectly, deliberately, as if pointing to it. Elias's breath caught. Alden crouched, holding the harmonic register over the door. The device sang, not loudly, but with the clarity of something responding joyfully to being understood. A long, steady vibration, more harmonious than any they'd recorded before. "The cycle's nearing its peak," Alden said. "This is the moment Maeve wrote about, the moment she waited for." Elias looked at the iron key sitting on the small shelf near the wall, the key they had found hidden among the letters. It looked older tonight, as if the fog had awakened the metal itself. The second beam passed over the trapdoor again, brighter this time. Alden met Elias's gaze. "You know what this means." Elias nodded, feeling a calm resolve settle into him. The quiet kind one feels when stepping into something that has been waiting for years. "It's time," he said. Alden picked up the key. Elias laid a steady hand on the trapdoor. Together, they waited for the second beam to align once more, for the silence to deepen, for the tremor beneath the floor to rise in its gentle, ancient cadence. And when all three aligned, beam, silence, tremor, The lighthouse exhaled, a soft, nearly inaudible sound. A release. Elias's voice dropped to a whisper. "Open it!" Alden lowered the key toward the ancient lock, and the deeper hour welcomed them. Chapter 10. When two times met. There are moments in a life, rare, quiet, unassuming, when the world narrows to a single point, and everything before it feels like preparation. Elias felt that as Alden lowered the key toward the trapdoor's ancient lock. The deeper hour pulsed beneath the floor with a steady, patient rhythm, like a faint heartbeat remembering how to beat after a century of silence. The second lantern's soft silver beam traced the wood with trembling certainty, illuminating the lock as though illuminating the next line in a long-awaited story. Alden hesitated for only a breath, long enough to meet Elias's eyes. "You're sure?" Elias nodded. "It's time." The key slid in with surprising ease. Not the grinding protest of rusted metal, but a smooth, almost welcoming motion, as if the lock had been waiting for years to be touched again. Alden turned the key. A single click sounded, soft as a pebble settling into sand. The lighthouse shuddered, gently, not violently, a low exhale beneath their feet. Elias felt it rise through his boots, through his legs, into his chest, as though the tower itself were adjusting to a new alignment. The trapdoor loosened. A soft, ancient draft pushed upward, carrying a scent Elias couldn't quite place. Not mold, not damp stone, but something older and strangely clean. A scent like air that had been protected rather than forgotten. They lifted the trapdoor together. Below lay a narrow staircase carved into the stone, spiraling downward with a precision that didn't match the lighthouse's rougher architecture. These steps were older, much older. Their edges worn not by weather, but by centuries of deliberate footsteps. Alden held the harmonic register above the opening. The device trembled in a steady, rising hum. "It's calling to something down there," he whispered. Elias lit a lantern, the ordinary kind, warm and golden, and descended first. The deeper hour pulsed with him, each step in quiet harmony with that ancient rhythm. Alden followed, the harmonic register vibrating more intensely the lower they went. The stone walls were cool, but not cold, smooth, but not polished. Every surface seemed touched by a care that preceded the lighthouse by generations. The staircase opened into a circular chamber. Elias stopped on the last step and simply stared. The room was larger than expected, 20 feet across, perhaps more. Its ceiling domed, its floor made of the same spiral pattern that had appeared in the tide's foam and in Maeve's sketches. Only here, the spiral was carved deeply into the stone, so precisely that even after centuries it remained sharp. In the center of the room stood another lantern, not like the one above, not metal, not glass. This lantern was carved from stone, a single piece, flawless, impossible in its craftsmanship. A narrow slit in its center emitted the faintest silver glow, the same quality of light as the second beam in the lantern chamber above. Alden stepped forward, breath shallow, eyes wide. "This," he whispered, "is the original." Elias approached slowly, the warm lantern in his hand flickering against the cool stone surface. As he neared the carved lantern, the second light inside it pulsed. A gentle, slow rhythm, not a flicker, a heartbeat. The chamber trembled faintly in response, not in danger, but in recognition, as if the arrival of two attentive caretakers completed a cycle left unfinished long ago. Elias traced a hand lightly along the carved stone, warm, not from heat, from something older, something alive with memory. Alden circled the outer edge of the room, running his hands along the markings carved into the wall, lines, arcs, indentations that matched no maritime design, but felt deeply intentional. He paused at one marking, a symbol resembling two overlapping circles. "The 2 hours," he said, "the surface one and the deeper one." Elias nodded. "Who made all this?" Alden didn't answer. Instead, he raised the harmonic register toward the central lantern. The device let out a pure, steady tone. The carved lantern responded. Its glow brightened, softly, not blinding, like moonlight on still water. Elias stepped back. Alden did too. The deeper hour began to shift. The room filled with a slow, pulsing resonance that wasn't sound and wasn't silence, but something between the two, a deep, ancient cadence that made Elias's watches both stop and start again in perfect unison. For the first time since he arrived on the headland, the 2 hours aligned. One pulse, one rhythm, one time. The silver glow rose along the spiral floor, illuminating the walls with gentle waves of light that moved like slow tides. Elias felt a softness settle inside him, a clarity that wasn't thought but understanding. Alden spoke quietly, reverently. This chamber wasn't built to keep time. He touched the central lantern. It was built to remember it. The second light, the deeper hour, pulsed once more. Alden stepped back as the floor trembled with a long, quiet sigh. The carved lantern's glow reflected against their faces, and for a moment, Elias felt a presence behind the light. Not a person, not a spirit, but the echo of a people who had known something the modern world had forgotten. That time had depth, layers, currents, tides, and the lighthouse had been placed above this chamber not to replace it, but to protect it, to continue its work long after its original keepers were gone. Alden swallowed hard, voice barely audible. "This is what Maeve felt," he said. "What she waited for." Elias nodded. "And what we were meant to finish." The pulse of the deeper hour softened, slowed, settled into a steady rhythm, one that matched the sea above, the fog outside, and the lantern turning in the tower. The two times had met, and the lighthouse had been waiting centuries for that convergence. Elias placed his hand on the carved lantern. "What do we do now?" he whispered. The deeper hour answered, not in words, but in the gentle, steady glow of a lantern built before history remembered to write itself down. Alden looked at him, calm and certain. "Now," he said, "we listen." Chapter 11. The Long Walk. Down the spiral stairs, when two times finally met in the chamber beneath the lighthouse, the air changed. Not dramatically. There was no surge of wind, no quake, no flash of impossible brilliance. But subtly, as though the entire tower had shifted its posture, a long set bone easing back into its proper place, a forgotten mechanism finally aligning with the rhythm it had been built to honor. Elias lingered beside the carved stone lantern, keeping one hand lightly against its surface. The warmth he felt wasn't heat at all, but presence, a quiet acknowledgement, the way cool water acknowledges the shape of a hand pressed into it. The deeper hour pulsed once more, softer now, as if content. Alden was the first to step back from the center of the room. He lifted the harmonic register, watching its needle steady into a calm, unwavering vibration. "It's not calling anymore," he said. "It's settling." Elias nodded. "That's why Maeve stayed awake at night. She felt this moment coming." Alden turned toward the stairwell, the warm lantern Elias carried throwing soft arcs of gold along the stone walls. "Come on," Alden said gently. "Let's see what's changed above." The climb back up felt different. The stone staircase, which had always carried a slight, ancient chill, now felt neutral, balanced. No draft from below, no unexplained warmth. Each step echoed with the quiet dignity of a place that no longer needed to hide its purpose. Elias moved slowly, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The lantern flickered with each turn of the stair, creating thin crescents of light that rolled over the walls like calm waves. About halfway up, Alden paused, one hand resting on the smooth stone. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Elias did. The tremor, the faint heartbeat beneath the tower, was gone. Not suppressed, not muted, gone. It was as if the deeper hour, having finally aligned, no longer needed to push through the surface world to be acknowledged. Its pulse had found its resting place. Alden spoke softly. "All this time, the lighthouse was trying to correct something, trying to complete a cycle." "And now it has," Elias murmured. When they reached the trapdoor, the second lantern above was still shining, its faint silver trail moving across the lower chamber wall in a slow, graceful arc. But it was more stable now. No skipping, no lag, no stray drift. Alden watched the ghost beams sweep over the room. "It's clearer," Elias nodded, "because the deeper hour isn't competing anymore. It's in step." They climbed the next flight of stairs to the lantern room, With each turn, the air became lighter, not physically, but in spirit, as though the tension that had stretched through the tower had finally snapped back into harmony. At the top, the main lantern cast its bright, dependable glow through the fog. The second lantern's silver echo shimmered behind it, faint but steady, like moonlight paired with firelight. Where once the two beams had disagreed, drifting in their own directions, now they turned in quiet synchrony. Elias approached the great lens, resting his fingertips lightly on the frame. "It's calmer," he said. "Balanced," Alden agreed. "Even the fog feels different." He was right. The fog, still thick around the tower, no longer pressed or curled with restless, searching behavior. Instead, it drifted slowly, passively, like a curtain drawn across a quiet stage. The entire lighthouse felt relieved. Elias looked out the window toward the invisible sea below. "I think the deeper hour was never meant to run alone," he said. "It needed to meet us, or maybe we needed to meet it." Alden gave a thoughtful nod. "Time isn't simply measured," he said. "It's remembered, held, tended to." He gestured to the spiral staircase. Those who built the foundation understood that. They built 2 lanterns to ensure the memory remained. Elias leaned against the wall, absorbing the soft resonance still lingering in the room. "Do you think the lighthouse was waiting for someone?" he asked. "Not someone," Alden replied. "Anyone patient enough to listen." The lantern rotated once, twice, both lights moving in harmony now, tracing a gentle thread through the fog. A quiet understanding settled between them. The lighthouse wasn't haunted. It wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't broken. It had been lonely. For decades, maybe centuries, it had carried 2 hours without anyone to help bridge them. The deeper hour had pulsed beneath the floor like a message trapped behind glass. The upper lantern had tried to mimic it, sending out silent signals in fog and silence, but no one had listened closely enough. Until now. Elias felt a stillness inside him that he'd never known, a sense of belonging, not just to his duties as a keeper, but to something older, something that respected patience and quiet attention. Alden stood beside him, arms folded lightly, eyes reflecting the slow-turning beams. "It will hold steady now," Alden said, "as long as someone keeps watch." Elias smiled softly. "I intend to." Alden lowered the harmonic register. Its hum had finally gone silent, not dead, but satisfied. They descended from the lantern room together, the soft beams tracing the walls behind them, illuminating the spiral staircase in warm gold and cool silver. The deeper hour receded into its rightful place, not hidden, not forgotten, but aligned. And as Elias reached the lower chamber, he paused once more by the trap door. The wood felt cool now, still, rested. He whispered, not to Alden, not to the tower, but to the quiet beneath them. "Thank you." The silence that followed didn't press or pulse. It simply rested with him. He closed the trap door gently, as one might tuck a child into bed. And together, in calm, unhurried steps, they walked back into the lighthouse's familiar air. A place not changed, but revealed. Chapter 12. What the lighthouse chose to keep mourning came slowly to the headland. The fog thinned, not in retreat, but in a graceful settling. The way a curtain lowers at the end of a long performance. The sky above remained soft and pale, with streaks of muted gold gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. Even the gulls seemed quieter, offering only a few distant cries, as though aware the lighthouse was waking from a long, private conversation with the deeper hour. Elias stood on the small balcony just below the lantern room, hands resting on the cool railing. The air tasted clean, washed somehow, as if whatever had stirred in the night had rinsed the world with something older than weather. Below him, the tide rolled in with perfect punctuality. No second rhythm, no split cadence, just the steady, reliable breathing of the sea. Alden stepped out behind him, the harmonic register tucked under his arm. He looked more rested than he had in weeks, though neither of them had slept. "How does it feel?" he asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. He just let the morning settle into him. "It feels," he said at last, "as if the lighthouse finally knows we're here." Alden nodded, his eyes tracing the clean arc of the turning lantern above them. "It's stable now," he said. "I checked the timing 3 times. The deeper hour isn't fighting for alignment anymore. It's in step, quietly, naturally. Elias smiled faintly. So all of this, the watches drifting, the strange tremors, the second tide, it was the lighthouse trying to reconcile the two times? I think so, Alden replied. Or reconcile itself. The words landed with a calm certainty. Elias turned, looking back toward the trapdoor far below, the one that now felt less like a boundary and more like a doorway gently closed, respectfully, with nothing pressing from the other side. What do you think the chamber was meant to protect? He asked. Alden leaned his elbows on the railing. Memory, he said simply. Not events, not stories, something deeper. An older way of marking time, not by seconds or minutes, but by cycles, by the hidden rules the tide follows, by the breath of fog. Elias thought of Maeve then, her sleepless nights, her unfinished pages, her patient devotion to the deeper hour. She hadn't failed, she had simply lived before the moment was ready. And now, that moment had passed through the lighthouse like a quiet visitor. Alden opened the harmonic register and showed Elias the small dial inside. Look, he said. The needle, once erratic and restless, was perfectly still, balanced in the center, peaceful. Will it ever move like it did again? Elias asked. Alden shook his head. Not unless the deeper hour falls out of alignment. And now that the chamber is recognized again, it won't. There was no triumph in his voice, just quiet gratitude. They went back inside, descending the spiral stair with the ease of men returning home, rather than climbing down from a mystery. The lighthouse felt warmer now, not in temperature, but in presence, as if it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too many years. Elias paused in the lower chamber, resting a hand against the central column. The silence was different, not thick, not restless, not listening for someone to finally understand, just silence, ordinary, comfortable. The kind of silence a well-built structure keeps when it's at ease. Alden set the harmonic register on the table and began packing his satchel. Elias watched him, a mixture of admiration and quiet sadness threading through his thoughts. You're leaving, he said softly. Alden nodded. I came to measure a mystery. Now it's no longer a mystery. It's part of the lighthouse, part of its design. Elias pointed toward the trapdoor. But there's more down there. Yes, Alden agreed, but it's at rest now, and we shouldn't disturb what's finally found peace. Elias understood. Some things are meant to be uncovered, some are meant to be witnessed, and some are meant simply to be kept, gently, quietly, by those who know how to hold them without asking more than they are willing to offer. Alden stood by the doorway, pulling on his coat. You're the right keeper for this place, Elias Rowan. The lighthouse knows it. You've listened better than any of us. Elias looked up toward the turning lantern. I think it always wanted someone who would. Alden smiled, a small one, but genuine. Keep its memory, he said. Both ours. I will. Alden hesitated, then added, almost as an afterthought, You know, if the deeper hour ever stirs again, it won't be a warning. It'll be an invitation, a reminder. You won't be alone in it. Elias nodded, feeling those words settle somewhere deep. He watched Alden walk the long path toward the village until fog softened his figure into a pale outline, then swallowed him entirely. The lighthouse hummed softly as Elias returned inside, not a mechanical hum, but the gentle resonance of a place in harmony with itself. The second lantern's silver beam lingered for a moment longer that night, though faint, as if offering a quiet farewell before settling into its natural rhythm once more. Elias wrote in his logbook, The hours agree now, the deeper one rests, and yet the memory of it remains, in stone, in tide, in fog, in silence. The lighthouse keeps what was entrusted to it, and I will keep the lighthouse. That evening, as the lantern turned in its long, graceful arc and the silver echo followed tenderly behind, Elias stood alone in the chamber and whispered into the still air, I'm here, I'll listen. And the lighthouse, calm at last, kept watch with him. Settle in now. We've reached the quiet shoreline of the story, and from here on, everything softens. The lighthouse stands steady on its headland again, 2 times resting in a single, peaceful rhythm. The deeper hour no longer pushing or pleading, but drifting calmly beneath the stone like a tide that has finally found its shore. You don't need to hold on to the details anymore. Let them drift the way fog drifts back toward the sea. Slow, unhurried, patient as breath. Just imagine that old tower breathing with you now, the lantern turning in its long arc, gold followed by silver, one after the other, guiding nothing and everything all at once. Two gentle lights, like two thoughts, easing into place. The stone stairs beneath your feet grow softer with each step you descend, spiraling smoothly, rounding into stillness. The sound of your movement quieting, thinning, until the stairs become simply the memory of stairs. And beneath it all, that deeper hour, not a clock, not a rhythm you must understand, just a calm, slow pulse, like the steady roll of the tide against distant rocks, coming in, drifting out, each wave smoothing the edge of the day a little more. You can breathe in time with it now. Let the inhale lengthen. Let the exhale fall away. Nothing sharp, nothing asked of you, just the gentle carry of a world settling into night. Picture the fog outside, not heavy now, not searching, simply resting against the windows, as though the sky itself has grown drowsy. It holds the tower the way sleep holds the body, carefully, without rush. Elias keeps watch, but even he grows still, the lantern glow softening across his shoulders. He knows the lighthouse is at peace. He knows the deeper hour has found its place. And with that certainty, he stands with the sort of calm that doesn't ask for anything more than this moment. You can stand there with him, or sit, or simply drift, letting the turning light rock you gently the way the sea rocks a small boat at anchor. No need to follow the story anymore. Let it fade. Let the names and places dissolve like ink in water. Let the only thing remaining be the steady comfort of knowing the world is older than its troubles, quieter than its noise, wiser than the clocks that try to measure it. Let your breath soften. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your thoughts drift into that silver echo, the one that follows just behind the day's brightness, patient and true. And, as the lantern completes another slow, perfect rotation, and the deeper hour hums faintly beneath the stone, you can rest in knowing that some mysteries don't demand answers. They simply ask for presence, for quiet, for listening, just like this moment. So sink a little deeper, let the edges blur, let the night fold around you in the gentlest way it knows how. Everything important has already happened. Everything else can wait. The lighthouse keeps its watch, the tide breathes, the fog settles. And you can drift. In the end, the truth remains open to interpretation.